Hello and welcome everyone back to the NPC Dungeon. Before I begin, I want to make a quick note. I realized that before I said that I was going to be releasing episodes on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, but I'm finding now that most of my weeks are going to be just Friday, Saturday weeks, the DM Advice episodes on Friday, and D&D stories on Saturday. But moving on, as promised this week, I have an episode all about how to deal with some of the more random and unpredictable things your players might do. It can be hard to improv every single time something unexpected happens. That's where planning and prior knowledge come in. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about how knowing where you are as a DM or a GM, knowing your players and their characters, knowing your world, your story, and your NPCs, planning in a structured yet open-minded way, and really zooming in and rolling up your sleeves and planning for different possible outcomes can really help you deal with almost any random thing your players can throw at you. If any of those points don't make a lot of sense, I promise I'll clear it up before too long. Those are the 5 points I'll be talking about. But for now, let's begin with the first one that I mentioned, knowing yourself and where you are as a DM. So let's learn something. For any other point, this may seem like a perfectly logical place to start, but here in an episode on planning for what your players might do, it may seem a little out of place. Let me make my case. The amount of random, game-changing things your players can do depends at least in part on how open-ended or sandboxy the game you're running for them is. In short, the more sandboxy the game, the more opportunities they have for randomness. And I don't just mean in terms of the overall campaign. I'm also referring to your plot arcs, sessions, quest adventures, and even encounters. When you start planning for one of those, you create the starting point and should have at least an idea of where your players are going to go with it. Some examples are just more open-ended than others. For example, a combat encounter where the party just kind of gets attacked by a random monster is probably going to end up being a lot less open-ended than an encounter where your players come across an old enemy of theirs that got away but ended up being locked up in a cage in a kobold den. There are a lot of moral directions that one can go in. You decide at least the context of the encounter. In fact, I already have a whole episode dedicated to just this idea of controlling the context of encounters, so click on that card above or go down to the description below if you want to watch that one. But for now, knowing where you are as a DM or a GM and what you are and are not ready for can help you either minimize or maximize the amount of player nonsense that you might want to deal with. I also mentioned this in my video on how I tend to structure encounters if you want to check that one out in the card or the description. Now obviously this isn't an exact science. The general culture of your table and identity of your players come into play here as well. Some people just play a little bit more chaotically than others, and that's just what my next point is about, knowing your players and knowing their characters. Now to start, I want to say that I already have an episode about something like this, so I'll link down as well if you're interested, but that one focuses more on how to plan for and incorporate what your players may want out of the game. For now, I'm talking about how knowing your players can help you determine what they may do so that you can plan for it. And this kind of makes sense, right? If you have a player who's obsessed with taming every single creature they come across, you know what to plan for. If you have a player who loves puzzles and will instantly figure out your plot, you know to plan for them maybe either getting bored or trying to find the quickest solution to things. If you have a player who likes being over the top or a player who just likes to steal everything that isn't nailed down, then you also know what to plan for. This also applies to their characters, as long as they stay in character, that is. If you have a character who hates kobolds, you know exactly what they'll do if you put them in a group of kobolds. You can even use this to plan interesting encounters too. You may plan to put them in a group of kobolds where they have to work together for whatever reason. That can be pretty fun actually. Done well, this can lead to some pretty spectacular encounters. You can plan with this in mind, and in a way, this kind of allows you to know what your players will do even before they do. And this is one of the most potent tools you have when preparing for this. So you need to be paying attention to your players as they play, and know their characters, and use this as much as you can when playing. It isn't easy, and I know it's a lot to keep in your mind, and even I struggle with mode advice here, but this little bit of extra work can make all the difference. But your players aren't the only things you should know, but more about that in my next point. This may sound a little obvious, but it pays to know your world, your story, and your NPCs. If you know your story, when your players do something that would change its direction, which they should and constantly will, you'll be better able to resiliently react and use this to enable you to run a more robust story. For example, what if your players end up accidentally releasing a big boss monster onto a city? Where does the story go from there? Well, do you have a group of monster hunters nearby? Maybe they're looking for it. If there is an evil bad guy trying to capture it, what did they do? Where are they at? And what about where it was initially? Was it there by choice, or was it captured and put there? What about about that? How did that happen to it? And you can probably already see how this plays right into knowing your world. Planning for and knowing these things and having that prior knowledge allows you to have the entire world react in a realistic way to whatever just happened without having to go and create 1,000 little contingencies. Plus, it makes you look like you planned for everything and knew exactly what's about to happen, and that's always a good feeling. But, and I already hinted to this a few times at this point, but a lot of the action hinges on your NPCs, and at least for me, this is one of the harder parts to plan for. How will the NPCs react, and what will they do? Well, knowing them is a good place to start. And I don't just mean know their backstory and personality, though that is a good place to start for this starting place, I guess. I mean, know what stake they hold in the overall story. How will what is happening affect them, and how will they most likely respond? This is where knowing their background and personality really comes into play. It serves, at least for me, in the way that I plan, to provide a kind of a backbone to how they will react in the story. And knowing your story and knowing your world can help you know exactly what kind of stake they actually have. Know what they want and what they don't want, and then you can already have figured out what they will do to get what they want and what they don't want, and how they will react to what changes that, how they will react to what the players do and to what happens in the world. For example, if your player steals something from one of your campaign's villains, and you know that this villain A needed that for their plan, and B is really insecure and unstable, they may send waves upon waves of bounty hunters after the players in an unhealthy obsession with bringing them in that clouds everything they had planned for. There are a lot of ways that one can go, and this one just sounds really fun. I might actually do that one day. But anyway, everything that I've mentioned so far comes down to that prior knowledge part of this topic that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. What about the planning part? Well, let's talk about this next. First, I want to say that it helps, at least in the very beginning of your planning, to not think about it as a list of things that your players can do with countless contingencies you need to plan for. I find that at least a little bit overwhelming. And I actually said this in my episodes on prison breaks. I'll try to link those down below as well for more information on that if you're interested. But for those of you who haven't seen them, I said to plan things like a mystery by just kind of placing things in the world as if it exists outside of your players and can very well go on without them. This is what I meant at the very beginning of this episode when I said to plan in an open-minded way. I'm not saying plan minimally or to not plan at all. What I'm saying is to plan in a way where your players don't have to do a specific thing to get the story to move on. This really sets the stage for your players to do some really major game-changing stuff, and even helps you to know when and where it can happen. At least for me, it really helps organize my thoughts. Plus, keep in mind, this is only the beginning of your planning. After this, you can, and definitely should, zoom in and start planning more specifically, and thinking about those individual contingencies that can happen. But more on that next. After you have everything down that makes up the arc or adventure or encounter or whatever, and by this I mean all the NPCs, all the story elements and plot points, and all the world building elements and whatever else you need all ready and placed throughout the world, then you're ready to start the real work. Now, I'm sure a lot of people, myself included, sometimes when I'm feeling just lazy, just stop right here. I'm not perfect, I'm not saying you should, but it's best to go just a little bit further and start thinking about what will happen if your players, for example, do action X or action Y, and then how you can respond to it. Think of all the solutions that you can. This is where knowing your world and story and context and everything comes into play. And then think about what your players might do. This is where knowing your players and their characters comes into play. You might even stumble upon exactly what a player of two of yours might do, yet another way of doing exactly what they'll do before even they do. See, there are so many ways of predicting your players' actions that it doesn't even seem as scary or impossible when you really start thinking about it. But again, I want to remind you, do keep an open mind here. And by this, I mean, don't hold yourself to any one outcome so that you overlook or forget to plan for the others. You won't see everything anyway, and there are some things that will appear super obvious after they already happened, and you're going to wonder why you hadn't seen it coming in the first place. So don't shortchange yourself where you can help it. Plus, the more you plan for, the more flexible and able to adapt you're going to be. And trust me, you'll need to be when unexpected things start happening, because they will start happening. But that's it for today's episode. Don't forget to let me know what you think in the comments if you want. If not, that's fine too. Let me know if you like these points, or if you think I left anything out. I'm trying out a bit of a new schedule where I release videos on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, but like I said earlier on this episode, it'll usually just end up being Fridays and Saturdays. So be sure to come back next weekend where I'll talk about planning for some of the more open-ended and sandboxy adventures I was talking about earlier on in this episode, and where I tell more about the story of Brynwyn that I started a few weeks ago. She's a character that I more recently played. But anyway, that's it for this week. Until next time, let's learn something.